This is 99 Novels, a podcast by the International Anthony Burgess Foundation. In 1984, the writer Anthony Burgess selected his 99 favourite novels in English since the outbreak of the Second World War. Never short of an opinion about books, Burgess's list is typically idiosyncratic and invites closer attention, so we've invited some of the leading scholars, critics and writers to tell us more about each of the 99 novels. So read along with us as we explore a reading list created by one of the most original literary voices of the 20th century. In this episode, Andrew Biswell talks to Brian Boyd about Vladimir Nabokov's novel Pale Fire, which Anthony Burgess called a brilliant confection. Pale Fire is unlike any other novel. The first section takes the form of a 999-line poem by a murdered poet called John Shade. The second section concerns the discursive commentary and notes by Shade's supposed editor Charles Kinbote. Seemingly unconnected to the poem, Kinbote's notes describe his belief that he is Charles the Beloved, the exiled king of a country called Zembla. Can this be true, or is Kinbote a fantasist? Does Shade's poem really reference the revolution in Zembla? Is Shade even real? These are just some of the questions raised by this rich and puzzling novel. Vladimir Nabokov was born in St. Petersburg in 1899, and being of aristocratic heritage was exiled from Russia when the Bolsheviks seized power. Having studied in Britain, he settled in America in 1940, lecturing in Russian literature at Wellesley College in Massachusetts and Cornell University in New York State. His novel Lolita, published in 1955, brought him fame and was filmed by Stanley Kubrick from Nabokov's own screenplay in 1962. Nabokov died in Switzerland in 1977. Brian Boyd is University Distinguished Professor of English Emeritus at the University of Auckland, New Zealand, and one of the leading experts in Nabokov's work. His writings about Nabokov include Nabokov's Ardour, The Place of Consciousness, Nabokov's Pale Fire, The Magic of Artistic Discovery, and 2 volumes of biography subtitled The Russian Years and The American Years. He is currently working on a biography of the philosopher Karl Popper, along with a follow-up to his book on the origin of stories, evolution, cognition and fiction, a book on Shakespeare's plays, 2 books on Lolita, and a continuation of his annotations, a chapter at a time, to Ardour, already almost 2,500 pages, with about 500 to go. He is also co-editing Nabokov's lectures on Russian poetry, prose and drama. For all the relevant links and a list of all the books mentioned, check out the description of this episode. Here's Andrew Biswell, who spoke to Brian Boyd about Vladimir Nabokov's Pale Fire in July 2024.
Brian, welcome first of all to the 99 Novels podcast. We're very pleased that you're here as the expert on Nabokov. Perhaps we should start with the author's name, which he always used to correct people's pronunciation when he was giving interviews. So how should I say it? How should we say it?
Okay, well, it should be Vladimir Nabokov. So it's a fully Russian one with a D. It has a kind of Z almost. Vladimir Nabokov. As long as it's not Vladimir, as he put it, to rhyme with Faramir, an imagined place in England.
I will do my best. First of all, then, I'd like to ask you about the importance of this novel to you as Nabokov's biographer and as the author of a critical book about the novel itself.
No book has been more important to me ever, I think, than Pale Fire. It set me on the course that I pursued for the last 50 years or so. My parents both left school in Northern Ireland at 14 in the Depression, and so didn't have the advantages of a higher education, saw my passion for books. We had a little corner store in the city where I grew up, and then after that, they bought a bookshop which had a library, a rental library in it. And I used to reshelve the books there, and I saw that Lolita was both a dirty book and it seemed, and a classic. And I thought, oh, well, I have to try this. But I was about 12 or 13, and it went over my head. But I used to sort out the magazine orders, regular magazine orders for my parents, and sort of read every magazine in the course of doing so. And on the 23rd of May 1969, there was a cover story in Time on Ada, which was Nabokov's latest novel. And there was a boxed interview in the centre, which had the wonderful headline caption, "I've never met a more lonely, more lucid, mad mind than mine." And I thought, this sounds interesting, and read the interview and was just bowled over by it. And Ada wasn't available in New Zealand, but I went to the local public library and got the latest Nabokov I could find, which was Pale Fire. And I read it, I think, several times in the course of getting from the start to the finish. So because I trusted Nabokov after reading that interview, I followed all the little cross-references, see note to such and such. And so within a few pages of the start of the foreword, I was in on all sorts of secrets about Kinbote, about his sexuality, about his background in Zembla, about his being the king of Zembla, or at least thinking he was, and about his probably being mad. So this excitement of discovery was something that I've never felt so intensely before, and the only times I've felt it intensely since actually have been later working on Pale Fire for the book I wrote. And working on Ada, which I still do occasionally, quite often actually. So for me personally, it's been hugely important. As a biographer, it was odd. I wrote an MA thesis on what were then Nabokov's three latest books, Pale Fire, Ada, and Transparent Things. And I had written an essay in my undergraduate year, my first year at university, on Pale Fire, on the idea that Shade was the sole author. And that was so implanted in my brain that I reused it for the MA thesis and then used it as a chapter, the critical chapter on Pale Fire in the book. And then I realized a few years later there was a discussion online that I was wrong. and so there was another way of reading it that was much more interesting, much more related to the problems Nabokov had been setting up in the novel. So I wrote this book on Pale Fire in 6 weeks. It was such an intense burst of work. And then in 1999, I was speaking at the town hall in New York on the occasion of Nabokov's centenary. And there was a reporter in the audience who had written on Nabokov who heard just a little aside that I made that made it clear to him that I'd changed my mind on Pale Fire. So he rang me up in my hotel and then published a story the next week or so saying something like, "Stop the world, an academic has changed his mind." And when people ask me what book should they start Nabokov with, I don't usually recommend Pale Fire unless that I can tell that they've got very high literary standards and tastes. I'll recommend something like The Defense, say, which I see as one of Burgess's other 99 novel pick for Nabokov. But Pale Fire, I think, is his most perfect novel, and I think Robert Alter called it the most perfect novel ever written. And I think in terms of sheer perfection of form, I think it is hard to beat. I think Ada, which I've been working on my PhD and continuously almost ever since, is richer, but Pale Fire is more perfect.
Thank you. Quite a challenging next question. I wonder if it's possible for you to try to describe Pale Fire for somebody who'd not read it. I mean, what would you begin with?
You have to begin with its form, really. It's a 999-line poem by an American academic poet, John Shade, who dies just after completing it, and his manuscript is taken by his next-door neighbour, Charles Kinbote, who then writes a line-by-line annotation to the poem that bears no relationship most of the time to the poem, a foreword and an index. His commentary and foreword and index are utterly crazy in many ways. They tell the story of Kinbote himself and his alter ego, which he thinks he is Charles II, the last king of Zembla, who's been expelled from the country after a revolution. It seems likely that he's probably a Russian professor at the same little campus town where Shade lives. The poem is written in heroic couplets. Shade is a Pope scholar, and it's written in the form that Pope used most often, heroic couplets. It's an autobiographical poem which has as its centerpiece the suicide of his very unattractive young daughter. It's very poignant. I mean, it explores Shade's reflections on poetry and his quest for something, for the signs of something beyond death. But he's both unable to get any simple answers, but still hopeful that there is something beyond death. Kinbote's commentary to the poem, it's crazy, it's colourful, it's romantic. It tells a cloak and dagger story of his escape from Zembla, or Charles II's escape from Zembla. It also tells the story of Gradus, who's sent to assassinate him as he sees it, as the ex-king of Zembla, but in fact is the person who kills Shade just after Shade is written at the end of the poem. It also tells the story of their milieu in New Y, the campus town where Wordsmith University is placed, where Shade is an English professor and Kinbote probably a Russian professor. So it fills in details about Shade's autobiography that don't find a place in the poem, and also about the relationships between Kinbote and Shade. Shade puts up with Kinbote's intrusiveness. Kinbote wants him to write a long poem about his glorious past as Charles II and his escape to freedom in Zembla. But of course, the poem is actually about Shade and the loss of his daughter. So both the commentary and the poem are very centrally about loss in different kinds. The loss of the daughter for Shade, the loss of a kingdom where he was King Charles the Beloved, according to Kinbote. And Kinbote is also homosexual, and it sees in backcast Zembla as a land where homosexuality was regarded as the higher form of sexuality. It's a very funny novel. It's a very beautiful novel. It can easily be disconcerting if you're not used to making the jumps from note to poem and back. But it's got 4 stories in the commentary that all run more or less chronologically. So despite the apparent chaos, it's actually very ordered.
Thank you. That's wonderful. To continue with this idea, the reader who's coming to the novel for the first time, what do you think is the best way in? I mean, should one read the poem and then the notes and then the index, or you mentioned then jumping between them, which is also an interesting thing to do and something that the novel encourages and permits us to do. But also, what kinds of things should this first-time reader look out for, do you think?
I think I was very lucky. I don't know anybody else who's followed those cross-references in the foreword to later notes. See, the problem is, even if you do that once, by the second time you get a cross-reference, it's got a cross-reference within it, the note that you go to, and so you need about 5 fingers stuck in various parts of the book to keep your places. But I did that patiently, and it was exhilarating what Nabokov was letting me discover ahead of time, as it were. But you certainly don't have to do that. You're probably going to read the foreword to start off. It's very funny right from the beginning when Kinbote says, there is an amusement park right across from my lodgings. You can tell there's something very odd about this person, even though he started off in a very academic kind of way in the first lines. And he is clearly, I think you pick up very quickly within the foreword, a massive egoist. And he suggests that you buy 2 copies of the book, you go straight to the notes after reading his introduction and read the notes and the index, and then go back and read the poem and have the poem open and the notes. I don't know. I think some people do follow that advice and read the notes in sequence. The crucial thing, of course, is whether you read the poem first or the notes first, is to make sure that when you're reading the notes, you go back to the poem and see what line it's referring to and see how absurdly tenuous is the connection between Kinbote's note and what Shade is saying in the poem. There are really real glimpses of beauty and insight in Kinbote's commentary. He is a literature professor, after all, and occasionally hits the mark and explains things that may not have been apparent to a reader. A lot of people think the poem must be a kind of an almost satirical production because it is in a form that was not current at the time, when most poetry by serious poets was not into rhyme or formal structures. Shade's heroic couplets are really not like Pope's. Pope's has a very tight structure for each couplet, with lots of balances between the first and second half of the line, or between the first line and the second line. Shade tends to go in much longer verse paragraphs, and certainly not to have that Popean sense of a very, very ordered world that is reflected in Pope's prosody. I find it a very beautiful poem. Let me just read the opening lines. It starts off with Shade thinking back to his childhood and imagining picking up a bird, a waxwing that has killed itself against a window on a blue day. I was the shadow of the waxwing slain by the false azure in the window pane. I was the smudge of ashen fluff, and I lived on, flew on, in the reflected sky. And from the inside, too, I'd duplicate myself, my lamp, an apple on a plate. Uncurtaining the night, I'd let dark glass hang all the furniture above the grass. And how delightful, when a fall of snow covered my glimpse of lawn and reached up so as to make chair and bed exactly stand upon that snow, out in that crystal land. And of course, Kinbote's note to that crystal land is Zembla. He introduces Zembla at that point, and Zembla does seem both crystalline and very blue. He calls it our blue, innumerable Zembla, like the azure in the window pane. So, yeah, there are some who think Nabokov just must be satirizing ho-hum poetry. What, in fact, I think he's doing, Nabokov is going against expectations by having a prosaic poem and a crazily poetic academic commentary. And I think the poem is beautiful all the way through. It's interesting, on Nabokov discussion groups, occasionally somebody who doesn't like the poem grumbles and cites a particular line. And that makes me look at the line again and see exactly what Nabokov's doing. And it's always more surprising than you expect.
It's interesting, Burgess, too, in his commentary on Pale Fire in 99 Novels, he obviously admires the poem, and he sees Shade as what he calls a sort of Robert Frost, which is an interesting comparison. But he also says he says it's very moving, this meditation on the tragic end of the poet's daughter. So I think he'd certainly be of that party. I mean, yes, Kinbote is fascinating. We must talk about him, but let's, as you've said, not underestimate the importance of Shade.
I've read the poem aloud to, with the text in front of me, to friends in a bus in Russia and in a student apartment in Toronto. And, it always elicits tears at the midpoint. It really is very moving, yeah. And people love it, just hearing it out of the blue with no knowledge of Nabokov and no knowledge of the context.
People do love it. I had a student who, kind of for a bet, memorized all 999 lines and would recite it with what I took to be total accuracy. Kinbote, the editor of the poem, seems to foreground his unreliability as a commentator on John Shade's poem. My question here is it possible to read the novel and to remain certain about what he claims to be the exiled king of Zembla? How far is that sustainable, do you think?
I think most readers will come to the conclusion fairly quickly that, certainly by the end of their reading of the commentary, that Kinbote is probably mad, that he's probably fantasizing this past as King Charles II. I think none of us knows what the reality beneath the fantasy is. although I think we are led to strongly suspect that he is a Russian professor who's somehow had to flee Russia and can't cope with the loss of his homeland. But yeah, there are so many different kinds of unreliability in Kinbote. His just insufferableness as a neighbor. He spies on things that are going on in the Shade household from a box hedge which collapses under him. Just at a moment that we can work out, if we read the novel carefully, is when Shade is reading his wife the index cards of his text of the poem on which he's just described Hazel's suicide. He is insufferable as a neighbor, intruding on the privacy of the Shades. He tries to commandeer Shade for evening walks in which he can tell him about the glorious escape of Charles II. He's rude to people on campus, and you get the sense that he's just an extraordinarily compulsive egoist with a very tenuous grip on reality. And Shade, more than anybody else in the novel, tolerates his eccentricity and accommodates his insufferableness. But yes, you realize that it would probably be a major mistake to assume that Charles II is actually Kinbote.
Burgess, in his commentary, he uses the word hallucinations, which I found very interesting, thinking of the note that Kinbote finds in his pocket. And the word is partly obscured as the note's being crumpled. That, boy, do you have H something S. He thinks it's halitosis.
HAL ... yes.
Yeah, but I suppose there's an assumption there that Kinbote is fantasizing to some extent. I wanted to bring in this other main character, Jacob Gradus, the would-be assassin of Charles the Beloved, also known as Jack Gray, Jack Degree, or Dargus, Dargus, an anagram of Gradus. And then readers will notice there's a mirror in the royal palace made by the Sudar Company, a mirror image of the name Gradus. So how can we understand this character, Gradus? Is he real, or is he some kind of projection, hallucination? What can we make of him?
Kinbote lives in a house that belongs to Judge Goldsworth, and at the end of Shade's finishing the poem, Kinbote comes over to him and invites him back to his house for a drink of Tokai. Shade likes a tipple, and his wife doesn't like him to drink too much, so he happily comes over. He's just crossing the lane into the Goldsworth house, and at that point, it seems somebody who was sentenced to prison by Judge Goldsworth and is now released shoots Shade, thinking that he is Goldsworth, and there does seem to be a strong physical resemblance between the two. So that seems to be the real element of the Jacob Gradus, and Kinbote kind of ramps up the tension in the commentary by synchronizing various key points of the composition of the poem, with Gradus's continuing approach towards New Y to kill him as Charles II, and he thinks that Shade sort of jumps protectively in front of the bullet that's meant for him. So it seems that everything that he concocts about Gradus is really just a very inspired series of inventions. Gradus, according to him, was a revolutionary glassmaker. So, and this is where things start to get kind of eerie in the novel, when you start to see connections between the poem and the commentary. Of course, the initial joke of the novel is that the poem and the commentary are so unrelated, but then you gradually start to see how many extraordinary connections there are. Gradus being a glassmaker and a mirror maker, in a sense, links up to the image at the beginning of the poem of the waxwing smashing itself against the blue pane, reflective pane of the window. Gradus is a way of Kinbote expressing his animosity against most of humanity, I suppose. So as Gradus approaches, he starts off as a very shady figure and then becomes clearer and sharper the closer he gets physically, according to Kinbote's invented narrative. So at one point, just before the assassination, the attempted assassination, Gratis seems to have food poisoning, and Kinbote exults in describing his diarrhea. So it's as if he's seeing him so vividly, he can see right inside his entrails. It's a bizarre story.
You mentioned this interpretation of the novel, according to which Shade is the true author of the book and Kinbote might be his creation. It'd be very interesting to hear more about that, and also about why you've come not to believe that's the case.
It's not only been proposed that Shade is the true author of the whole, including the commentary, but that Kinbote might be the true author of the whole. I think that is quite specifically ruled out by Nabokov, because he has Kinbote, who's never going to show himself in a bad light if he can possibly help it, tries to invent some variants of the poem that reflect directly the story of Zembla. But the poetry is so inept that it's just preposterously ludicrous to imagine that he could write the poem. Shade, on the other hand, is somebody who is obsessed with death, and Kinbote is not only thinks he's the ex-king of Zembla, but is preoccupied with thoughts of suicide. And it seems that he actually commits suicide just after completing the commentary. So it's possible, and this is how I took it for a long time, to think of Shade as wanting to express something about what he understands of death, not directly. And as he says in the poem, at the point where he's talking about this most seriously, life everlasting based on a misprint. I mused as I drove homeward, take the hint and stop investigating my abyss. But all at once it dawned on me that this was the real point, the contrapuntal theme. Just this, not text, but texture. And certainly there's a strong contrapuntal element in the relationship between the poem and the commentary, and between Gratis's approach and Shade's and Kinbote's life in New Why. So one could imagine, and I did and others did for a long time, that Shade is only pretending to have been killed at the end of the poem, that he's writing through the voice of Kinbote. He's exploring what it might be like to be somebody else so completely different from him as Kinbote is, and using that as a kind of figure for some kind of transformation of the self in death. And that would then explain all the connections between the poem and the commentary, the subterranean connections, like the one about the glass and the mirror. But there are various other connections that become more and more demanding of attention the more you reread the novel. I'm not sure exactly what it was that made me realize that it just wouldn't work, but Dmitry Nabokov's son and the co-translator of many of his father's works, said at one point in this internet discussion, where he was very much involved in those days, that his father said something like, in dismissing these theories of the single author version of Pale Fire, that Shade and Kinbote perhaps simply invented each other, which of course makes it impossible. Dimitri's citing that was one thing that made me change my mind, but it was also starting to see patterns in the structure of the commentary, and I realized that the Gratis fantasy in the commentary could only have emerged after Shade's death, and seems to reflect counterpoint in a strange way. There's a famous treatise on musical counterpoint called Gradus ad Parnassum by Fuchs in the 17th century. But a Gradus was also a dictionary that poets used to provide metrical information. And I came to the conclusion that it seems that Shade, after his death, has actually inspired Kinbote to think of Gratis and to make his approach towards the last line of the poem a structural feature in the commentary. That surprised me, but it probably surprises people listening to the podcast. But then Nabokov had done a number of works in which communication between the dead and the living is a feature. So the first of these, well, the most striking early example, early 1951, when he was writing Lolita already, is the Vane sisters, where a professor has a student who commits suicide and leaves a suicide note in her exam script, and he goes, when he was reading the script, he rushes to find her and finds that she is dead, and he knew her sister too. And this professor is led one day in a snowy day. He's looking at the shadows of icicles dripping from eaves, and he gets led to a place where he doesn't usually dine, and there's odd effects on the lighting and parking meters, the shadows of parking meters. At that restaurant, he bumps into somebody he knows who also knew the other sister, and learns of her death. And she was somebody who was interested in seances and the afterlife. And he ends his last paragraph in his story talking about a dream that he had that night, wishing that he could somehow connect with Cynthia Vane. But Nabokov gives a clue earlier in the story that if we read the last paragraph as an acrostic, it's actually a message spelt out: icicles by Cynthia, meter by me, Sybil. So it's a message that these two sisters have incorporated into his dream, where he's expressing his disappointment that he didn't have any connection with them after their deaths. And it's clear that they have led him through this whole trajectory of the whole day, from the icicles to the restaurant outside, which the shadows of the parking meters caught his attention. So that's an example of Nabokov exploring the idea of communication between the next world and this world that is intense, but is absolutely unreadable from within this world. But from our vantage point as readers outside, we can see the clues in the story. In my PhD thesis, I wrote about the character Lucette in Ada, who also commits suicide and seems to be intervening in Van and Ada's, her half brother and half sister, in their love life and in the actual composition of the novel. And nobody had really looked at that kind of thing apart. I mean, every careful reader will see what's going on in the Vane sisters and Transparent Things, but in a novel where that's not all but explicit, nobody had seen that. And just at the same time as I was writing that, Nabokov died while I was working on my PhD thesis. Vera Nabokov released a volume of poems, Russian poems by Nabokov, in which she wrote in the foreword, nobody seems to have realized the theme of Nabokov's work, the central theme of Nabokov's work, patostoronist, which means the other side, the other world, the next world. So I'd come up with my reading of Lucette's influence in Ada before that, but it was certainly very welcome confirmation. And so that's one reason why, when I came to rethinking the connections in Pale Fire, that I thought of Shade's influence on Kinbote after his death. And then I started thinking about Hazel Shade, the daughter of John Shea, who commits suicide. And I started thinking about the way the Zembla fantasy comes to Kinbote's imagination only after he becomes a next-door neighbor of Shade. And you can see how this works. There are clear signs that this is the case. So I hypothesized that Hazel from beyond inspires Kinbote, whose life is desperately unhappy, with this kind of consolatory fantasy that he was the king of Zembla. She can't communicate with her father directly. That seems to be barred by the rules of the relationship between the next life and this life. She influences this madness in Kinbote. And these images of blue and innumerable Zembla, the mirror, the glassmaker, and so on, they prompt Shade to think about writing an autobiographical poem with that image of the waxwing smashing against the window as the beginning. And I think there are all sorts of ways that you can see that Hazel has has been trying to inspire her father to write his magnum opus, and also a story that focuses centrally on the tragedy of her death. And I read it as a kind of way of saying that, yes, despite my unhappiness in life, I've entered a space of creativity that you'd be very pleased with, and that's helped your creativity. So it's a very convoluted argument, and I think there are also very, very many clues in the novel that Nabokov was planning things this way. But in my book on Pale Fire, I wanted to make sure that I didn't jump to that as a kind of solution straight away. And in fact, it almost embarrasses me to be talking about this now, but you prompted me, because I think readers should make these discoveries for themselves. So I deliberately talked about the impact of a first reading. I used an image that Nabokov himself used about his own life, the idea of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, developed from Hegelian notions. And he saw it as a kind of spiral into realms of greater freedom. So the thesis is simply reading the book straight, as it were, with Kinbote as actually Charles II. The second is the antithesis, trying to figure out what is really real in the novel. And as you do that, you see the increasing number of connections between the poem and the commentary that is supposed to be completely disjoint. And then the synthesis, which is the kind of solution that I suggested. So I deferred the reader getting to that. And I think Nabokov prepares a great many pleasures for the reader on the thetic level and on the antithetic level, even though it's frustrating. You want to resolve these connections between the different parts of the book, and you don't know quite how, but you do discover interesting things on the way. And as I say in the book on Pale Fire, I think Nabokov, who was a world-class lepidopterist, a specialist in butterflies, he was curator of Lepidoptera at Harvard's Museum of Zoology in the 1940s, and felt exhilarated by his work on butterfly genitalia using microscopes in those years. He wants to provide for his readers something of the sense of discovery that he felt in encountering nature.
Thank you very much. We should mention as well the presence of an index at the back of the book. Not many novels have indexes, but this one does. And this also seems to be part of the narrative, maybe complicating the situation yet further. It also seems to be incomplete. The final entry is Zembla, a distant northern land, but the line number we expect to find there is missing. So why is that? Why is that important? I mean, the index and that particular entry within the index to the meaning of the novel.
Well, the index seems to show Kinbote's fantasy about Zembla hardening, because a great many details in the index, a great many of the personages mentioned in the index are there only in the index. He seems much more interested in the history of Zembla and the history of regicide in Zembla than even in the commentary and the relationship between him and Shade, although he is very pleased with that. So he does give that much more space in the index than it would have warranted. So he seems to be, his imagination seems to be steeping itself more and more in the history of Zembla. And then at the end, yes, when there are no references in the index to Zembla, it is a strange effect. And Nabokov certainly intended it as a kind of poignant incompleteness. The poem itself is incomplete, so it's 999 lines in heroic couplets. I was teaching this with my former head of department in the class, and when I said 999 lines of heroic couplet, his head jerked up in surprise, because it doesn't make sense that there's an odd number when you've got couplets. And Kinbote actually hypothesizes that the last line is missing, and that we should go back to the first line, which does rhyme with line 999. And he could be right. That's uncertain. So there's an unfinishedness in the poem, or a circularity, and there's an unfinishedness in the index. It's one of those many connections between poem and commentary that start to get puzzling. Nabokov intended it, I think, but I don't think it's quite clear internally. But he said in an interview that he thought that Kinbote commits suicide after writing the last entry in the index and before getting to the page numbers. Of course, Zembla would have would have featured in almost every note. So there would have been many line references in the Zembla entry. But yeah, I think Nabokov doesn't quite make the reader, doesn't drive the reader to making that inference in a way that I think he intended. So Vera Nabokov described it as a kind of melting fade out, that Zembla, a distant northern land. And yeah, I don't know that has ever quite been the effect I've drawn from it, but Nabokov certainly intended it to be haunting, and I don't know. I'm just so blissed out by the time I get to the end of the novel anyway, when I reread it, that I don't worry about the absence of the page references there. I mean, I know it's coming, so yeah, I read it so many times.
One more question, which is beginning to sort of round off our fascinating conversation about this novel, and I wish it could be longer, but what do you think is the legacy, maybe the sort of ongoing impact, reputation of this novel in particular, of Pale Fire specifically, but also of Nabokov's work more generally?
Certainly, Pale Fire came to be seen as a classic of postmodern fiction, although the term postmodern hadn't really been surfacing while Nabokov was alive. And I think that's not quite right, because postmodernism tends to suggest a kind of irresolvability of an undermining of conventions and so on. Nabokov was very interested in refreshing conventions, but not undermining reality. He wanted to see reality deeper and deeper, and he tried to encourage his readers to see the reality of the stories deeper and deeper. But I think he was certainly a long way from the standard postmodernist tropes that were emerging in the 70s and 80s. But in terms of his reputation, I think he is regarded by many writers as their favourite novelist. So people like Orhan Pamuk, the wonderful Turkish novelist, is a great fan of Nabokov, and Martin Amis, Zadie Smith, all sorts of authors. Edmund White, interestingly, one of the most famous of gay novelists and the author of The Joy of Gay Sex, loves Pale Fire and doesn't find the depiction of Kinbote as homosexual, homophobic. So I think Nabokov is appreciated by writers, but I think also not so widely by readers. Lolita still sells an enormous amount, but Nabokov is to so many people known only by Lolita, which was a novel I took quite some time to warm to. I want to write a couple of books on it after I'm finished my current project. I'm appreciating it more and more, but for many readers, they only know Lolita, or perhaps even only know the name of Lolita, and nowadays, of course, students who are made to feel at risk if anything might offend them, given trigger warnings about novels and so on. I don't know how teachers actually have the nerve to teach Lolita anymore, even though it's quite clearly on the side of Lolita against the person who commits child abuse with her. So his reputation, I think, is well, certainly not as high as I would like it to be. He is very highly regarded by those who like demanding, very literary fiction. As Martin Amis said, he does all the usual things, so character, plot, structure, and creating scenes and so on, writing sentences better than everybody else, which I think is true. But he's very appealing to many readers who are prepared for some literary demand, but perhaps not demands as stringent as those of Ulysses. On the other hand, he is seen as a dead white male. He's clearly of a very, very Eurocentric disposition. So in the current preoccupation with race and sex and colonialism, he's fallen out of fashion and doesn't seem to be very well represented on bookstore shelves, if people still go to bookstores. I get the feeling that good readers, generations younger than me, have increasingly shallow sense of the history of literature, and so he seems like a distant classic, and I think people don't realise how fresh and how contemporary he really is.
Well, I think readers, if they don't know Pale Fire, certainly have a treat in store. And maybe we should echo Burgess, who always regarded Nabokov as a brilliant craftsman, and I think was very much one of the writers of his time who Burgess looked up to and kind of revered, though I think he found it very difficult to be reverent to anybody. But that comes through in his writing, I think. One more question for you. We're asking everybody contributing to this series of podcasts, if you could add a novel to Burgess's list, which one would it be and why?
I noticed that the list is supposed to contain novels written in English. And in fact, for Nabokov, he selects The Defense as well as Pale Fire, and The Defense was written in Russian. So I'm going to take that out and put two novels in place. So I would put it Lolita and Ada, and this might seem very unsurprising from somebody who's written so much on Nabokov, but Ada, I think, is his richest novel, and it's like a verbal equivalent in a way of Bosch's The Garden of Earthly Delight. So it's got some paradisiac images, some very ambiguous images about sexuality, and some hellish imagery. And it's also like the triptych of Bosch. It's inexhaustible. You look at details, you can look at it for years and years and still discover new details when you look closely enough. And that's certainly the case with Ada. And Lolita, well, wait till I've done my books on it and you'll see why I think it's so important. But in a way, I would like to include something that's not Nabokovian, but my favorite writer of novels alive at the moment is Orhan Pamuk, whom I mentioned, the Turkish writer, and of course he writes in Turkish. And I would put his A Strangeness in My Mind as my favorite current novel.
Well, we're very grateful for the recommendation, and thank you for illuminating Pale Fire for us. And as Kinbote says, I trust the reader has enjoyed this note. I mean, these notes, fascinating and entertaining, and also thought-provoking about Pale Fire. We're very grateful to you for taking part. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, and thanks for provoking me to think and talk about Pale Fire. It's always a pleasure.
You've been listening to 99 Novels, a podcast by the International Anthony Burgess Foundation. Nabokov's Pale Fire, The Magic of Artistic Discovery by Brian Boyd, is published by Princeton University Press. For more information about Anthony Burgess and the work of the Burgess Foundation, visit anthonyburgess.org. You can also subscribe to our free newsletter at anthonyburgessfoundation.substack.com. The theme music for the 99 Novels podcast is Anthony Burgess's Concerto for Flute, Strings and Piano in D minor, performed by No Dice Collective. Find them online at nodicecollective.com.